Washington Journal continues.
Joining us from the campus of Rice University in Houston, Texas, is Edward Djerejian, who is the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, served during the last year of the Reagan administration and in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. He is now the director of the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. Mr. Ambassador, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure to be with you.
So give us your broad overview of where we're at in Syria and, so far, the president's response and his push for military intervention.
Well, I think it's painfully obvious that the Syrian crisis is the problem from hell, and that there are very few good options for anyone, for the Syrian people, for the international community, for Syria's neighbors. But if you look back, when the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, came to Syria in March of 2011, there was some hope that the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, being a young, relatively young man, educated in London, started a nascent reform movement in Syria, that he would sort of get out ahead of the reform curve and start implementing some liberalizing measures in Syria. This, unfortunately and tragically, did not prove to be the case. And the international community gave him quite a pass for many months to do what, for example, the King of Morocco, Mohammed VI, did in Morocco. And he started to fire and use force and violence against his own people. I think it's important to just give you a little context of how the Arab Spring started in Daraa, in this southern town in Syria. It was a peaceful protest by Syrian high school students, not university students, high school students. And they protested and wrote graffiti on 2 buildings. And it's very symbolic. It tells you the whole story of what the problems were in Syria and are in Syria. The first building they went and demonstrated in front of, again peacefully, and wrote graffiti on, was the Ministry of Interior building, which is the symbol of the lack of political participation, democracy, oppression, the Secret Service, the police state. But the other building they went and demonstrated in front of and put graffiti on the walls was Syriatel, which is the cell phone company of Syria, and it is a state, it's a family monopoly by the in-laws of Assad's family, who monopolize some of the key economic sectors of Syria. So what these young kids, these young high school students knew inherently was that the problems that they were facing was the systemic political oppression of a dictatorial regime, systemic kleptocracy and corruption in the country, lack of jobs, lack of educational opportunities, and all the basic socio-economic issues that gave rise to the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, the protests became violent, both on the part of the regime and the opposition. And we've seen over the last 2.5 years a steady degradation of the situation on the ground. It is truly a humanitarian disaster with over 110,000 people killed, the use of chemical weapons, and sort of no way out in terms of a political solution, because both sides are really focused on a military solution. And let me just say a final comment here, that I think it's important that we understand that there is no military solution to the Syrian crisis. There's only a political solution. So anything we do militarily in the international community, the United States, should be within the strategic context of a political solution and what the political objectives should be, leading to a post-Assad era and a post-Assad regime.
Equation of the public support or lack thereof, and we've been asking our viewers and listeners this morning whether they support or oppose the use of military intervention, and this is the latest from a Gallup poll, and it puts it in perspective. in terms of past recent conflicts, including when you served in the Reagan and Bush administration. With regard to Iraq, once the military operation began, 59% of Americans surveyed supported our military intervention in Iraq. 82% supported it in Afghanistan. And during the Persian Gulf War, 62% supporting U.S. actions in the Persian Gulf. Right now, the number is 36% of Americans supporting it. With regard to Syria, 51% opposing military intervention. And from the Gallup poll, there is this survey, this graphic that puts it into perspective, and you can see just how low the public support is with regard to Syria. My question is this war fatigue, or are there other factors in play?
I think you're right. I think most of it is war fatigue because, you know, we have been at war in the Middle East ever since the tragic terrorist attack against our country and our homeland on 9/11. We went into Afghanistan, and rightfully so, to overthrow the Taliban regime that was giving safe haven to al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. That was certainly justifiable in every consideration. But then we've been in Afghanistan, continue to be in Afghanistan. We have poured much blood and treasure in that country. We launched the military action against Iraq in 2003, and again, much spilling of blood and treasure. We got involved in Libya in a different manner, but yet again, one more military intervention in a Muslim country. And I think the American people, if one can speak on behalf of the American people, but from all the polls that you've just cited, do demonstrate that when you look at the end results of Afghanistan and Iraq, it's not tidy, it's not neat, because these countries are facing incredible challenges, internal domestic challenges, and the United States cannot solve all of these challenges. We're not very good at nation building. We're very good because of our strong military and its exceptional professionalism. We're very strong in the military actions that we can take. We are truly the remaining superpower militarily globally. And no one comes near us on that. But in terms of facing these so-called domestic issues and nation building and promoting democracy, the report card is quite ambiguous. And I think the American people are looking at that and saying, in terms of Syria, why should we get involved yet again when we're trying to extricate ourselves now from these Middle East conflicts, and we have such pressing economic and social problems at home that we need to deal with. So these polls are serious, and it's a very important factor for the White House and the administration in terms of whatever decision the president is going to announce on military action in Syria.
Our guest is Edward Djerejian. He is joining us from Houston, Texas. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Syria, and he's also the author of the book Danger and Opportunity, An American Ambassador's Journey Through the Middle East. He is currently the director of the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. So if we don't act, if not us, who? And if not chemical weapons, what does the U.S. stand for? Where is the red line drawn?
Well, the red line has been drawn on chemical weapons by the president's own statements that the use of chemical weapons would constitute a red line. And it's a serious event when weapons of mass destruction are used internally in a country or against another country. And therefore, a case can be made that this use of chemical weapons in Syria, which is being documented and more information is being made public, but people are still looking for more evidence on exactly what happened and who pulled the trigger on this, although it is basically assumed that the Assad regime is responsible. But an argument can be made that the international community should react militarily to draw a line in the sand that the use of CWBW, chemical weapons, bacteriological weapons, will simply not be tolerated by the international community. But that's much more limited than taking military action to sort of level the playing field in Syria, whereby the regime has to date, on its account, 110,000 Syrians have been killed, apart from the use of chemical weapons. So there's a distinction here.
In addition to his work in the Bush and Reagan administrations, our guest, whose career dates back to the Kennedy administration as a civil servant and career foreign officer, served as the U.S. ambassador to Israel during the Clinton administration. He's also an Army veteran serving in Korea. And I want to share with you the comments issued over the weekend by former CIA Director General David Petraeus, who was asked whether he supports or opposes the use of military intervention. He does support it. And he says, quote, failure of Congress to approve the president's request would have serious ramifications, not just in the Mideast, but around the world. General Petraeus went on to say military action against the Syrian regime is thus necessary, not just to deter future use of chemical weapons in Syria and elsewhere, but also to ensure that Iran, North Korea, and other would-be aggressors never underestimate the U.S. resolve to take necessary military action when other tools prove insufficient. Again, that comment from former CIA Director General David Petraeus. Your thoughts, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, I think General Petraeus is making the argument that I referred to, that on the use of CWBW and weapons of mass destruction, the international community should take a strong stand in order not to create precedents where once these are used, they go unpunished and without a strong reaction. The problem is to get the international consensus to act in the most collective and meaningful manner in the international community, whereby President Obama and Secretary Kerry can build the largest possible coalition, if you will, a coalition of the willing, to go and take military action, and that we are not there alone. As you know, a major effort is being made by the President and the Secretary of State with the Europeans at the G20 meeting that recently concluded, because it's much more meaningful if there is a strong coalition. I recall in Desert Storm, before Desert Storm, in the Bush 41 administration, both President Bush and Secretary Baker made a huge effort to garner the largest possible international coalition to support military action against Saddam Hussein and driving him out of Kuwait. I was ambassador to Damascus at the time. I was dealing with the current president's father, Hafiz al-Assad, who, by the way, is the man who put this system in place in Syria that has proven to be quite resilient, this political, military intelligence and clan system in place. But we even got him to agree to join the U.S.-led coalition politically and even militarily against Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Now, the historical parallels are obviously not identical, but the point here is that the American position would be much stronger to the extent that there is a large, coherent international support and coalition behind taking military action. And let me say one other thing. As General Petraeus has mentioned, if we take military action because of the CWBW incident, you got to think of the day after. Is it only to punish the Syrian government for using CW and BW? Or should we not be thinking of not only taking military action to deter Syria and other countries, such as Iran and North Korea and others, not to use weapons of mass destruction, but should we also think of degrading the Assad regime's, some of its military capabilities, especially its monopoly of air power, helicopters, heavy artillery, their air bases, that really gives the regime quite a military advantage over the opposition. So that's another decision that the administration is going to have to make, and the president, I'm sure, will address this. What I foresee is either a very strict option on dealing with the CWBW issue, a punitive action to help deter the use of these weapons again. But if we're thinking about a political strategy in Syria, and again, I repeat, there's only a political solution to this crisis in Syria. What happens the day after? If we do take military action, should we also be doing certain things that could help facilitate a political solution whereby the political military playing field in Syria is made a bit more level, that would induce both sides to start talking about a political transition?
For Ambassador Edward Djerejian, our guest joining us from Rice University, Jerry is joining us, Northampton, Pennsylvania, Republican line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'd just like to say, how can anyone in the American public believe the president if he thinks he's the king? He's taken the oath of office twice, and as soon as he did that, he tried to change the U.S. Constitution with just whatever he felt like doing. Also, oh man, I've been waiting the whole time he started his program. His Obama health care, it's bull. I mean, everybody that's going to be hooking up with it, it's going to cost them a fortune just to get on it.
Okay, Jerry, thanks for the call. Well, let me take both of his points, get your reaction, because there's also the domestic political issues that this president will be facing with Congress as lawmakers return tomorrow. Mr. Ambassador, did you want to respond to that?
Well, I really don't know what the question is. I mean, the gentleman made a comment on President Obama's policies, but I think what he's reflecting also is the American public's priority on our domestic situation, on the economy, on creating jobs, on building our infrastructure. And I think behind any U.S. military involvement is the issue of how much money is this going to cost. Some government officials have stated, oh, it's only going to be about in the tens of millions of dollars. Well, we know that military operations are very expensive. And therefore, I think what the gentleman is reflecting is, apart from all the political and humanitarian considerations, can we afford to do this and divert ourselves from our domestic priorities?
You spent 3 years as our representative in Syria. You mentioned earlier your working relationship with President Assad and his father. What can you tell us about the family, the influence his father is now having on his son, and the dynamics within the family?
Well, the father, Hafez al-Assad, was a real solid autocrat, dictator. He was a strategic thinker. Henry Kissinger commented that he was probably the most intelligent negotiator in the Arab world that he dealt with. And in my 3 years, I had many, many meetings with him, and he is the man who put this political system in place in Syria. And he obviously has done a very good job, because with all this turmoil in Syria, that regime is still held together despite losing big swaths of territory to the rebels and the opposition and just the chaos in Syria. It's important, the difference between the father and the son. Hafez al-Assad, the father, knew where the red lines were with Israel, the United States, with his neighbors. He was a canny negotiator, but you could negotiate with him. I remember before I went out to Damascus as the new American ambassador in 1988, I was at a meeting in Washington with then Minister of Defense Yitzhak Rabin, who later became the Israeli Prime Minister. And when it was announced to him that I was going out to Damascus, he looked at me and he was puffing on his cigarette, and he said, well, Ed, you're going to be dealing with one of the most strategic thinkers in the Middle East. When he says yes, it's yes. When he says no, it's no. That has been our experience in Israel with him. But if you leave any loophole in your negotiating position, he'll drive a 2-ton tank or truck through it. And I always remember that statement because it turned out to be very true. And the difference between the father and the son explains a lot, I think, also of what we're seeing. I don't think the father would have allowed the situation to deteriorate to this point in Syria, where his regime would be so weakened and so threatened. But the son was not ready to take over power. The son, the elder son, who was groomed, Basil al-Assad, died in a car accident, and I had met him also, and he was really up to the job. But this president, Bashar al-Assad, was studying ophthalmology in London. And he had to, after his elder brother's death, he had to be trained immediately and on a short course to take over. And he took over in 2000 when his father died. And the thing is that there's too much ambiguity in his positions. If it's yes, you don't know if it's yes. If he says yes, if it's no, you don't know if it's no. And in the 3 meetings I've had with him, I've always come away not really being sure of what his actual position is. I think now Syria is not led by him alone, as it would have been under his father, but it's more a very small family clan, military intelligence elite that is making the key decisions. And this makes it more difficult for us to negotiate with them.
From our Twitter page, there is this, one of our viewers: if Syria is hell, no need to drag the U.S. there faster than we are getting there already. You can join in on the conversation at C-SPAN WJ. Robert is joining us from Harrison, Arkansas. Democrats line, good morning.
Good morning. My first statement is our fight is not with Syria. Our sight should be set on discrediting Putin. Russia armed Syria. Russia should be held accountable for the use and removal of the weapons she provided. We should be taking our cause to the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. You know, being a part of the free world economic system is not a right, it's a privilege. A privilege, you know, that demands upholding free world principles. Russia enabled Syria. In the same track, you know, I've heard all along, China has enabled North Korea and Iran. And if we can't hold these countries responsible, you know, I wish we could just drop a bomb and solve it. But the real issue is, how is a free world going to react? And for me, it should be products off the shelf before you put the missiles in the air.
Robert, thanks for the call. We'll get a response.
Robert's comment on Russia is right on the mark, because Russia plays such a critical role in the Syrian crisis. The Russian, Soviet-Russian-Syrian relationship goes back to the 1950s during the Cold War, where Syria was one of the proxy states of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And that relationship has continued after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's a very strong military relationship. The Syrian army and officers are trained by Russians. Many speak Russian, married Russian women. It's a very close relationship. Russia has a port facility access in the Syrian port of Tartus. It's its only.
Our guest is Edward Djerejian, who's joining us from Houston. We had a brief hiccup with the feed, so we'll get back to that in just a moment. Let me share with you some of the comments. This is an email from Lou, who said, would we bomb Russia if Putin did the same thing? I doubt it. We would seek economic sanctions. Do we want Al-Qaeda to control Syria? ? No. They would be to use Syria as a base to invade Israel. We unfortunately need to leave this evil despot alone so that Syria remains a country, not a war zone like Iraq. Leave them alone unless Syria invades another country, and then demolish them. And Laura has this point from our Twitter page saying, who supports Assad and why? And finally, another email from John in New Jersey. The rebels inside Syria are fighting their last battles as the Syrian government forces are poised to end this rebellion decisively. This proposed 90 days of U.S. bombing, said to be a response to the Syrian government use of chemical weapons, is a lie. The reason the U.S. is planning this attack on Syria is to see that President Assad does not finalize his victory over the rebels. regime change, question mark, or exclamation mark, I should say. Let's go to Joe, joining us from Smyrna, Tennessee. Your thoughts on all of this, Joe? Good morning.
Good morning. It's a thrill to talk to you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm very much against this proposed action, and I just want to make some really, really quick points.
Okay.
In terms of the country, we're bankrupt and circling the drain, in my opinion. $17 trillion in debt. And we're going to go fooling around overseas again and hope that we can militarily change everything, and we're just going to bomb them into submission. So where we are now with the U.S., being that we went into Iraq and got it all wrong there, is we have a credibility problem. The UN report, as far as I know, has not come back and told us exactly what's happened or who did it. Who did it? So we need to slow down. We need to slow down and go through the steps, report to the world. Then we get China and Russia to make a decision, as we've used all of our technology and all of our spy equipment and everything else to report to the world and allow them to see what it is that we're thinking. You know, people will go out and buy a car nowadays, and they'll require a Carfax. We don't even have the facts, folks. Second point. Unintended consequences. Ambassador, you'd know more about that than all of us combined. One thing that Assad can do is, after we lob in these bombs, is he could go ahead and ignite some chemicals and whatnot, and then, blame us and put the images out everywhere and really get things stirred up. And then you got Israel bombing Iran because we want to deal with their nukes. Last point. Moral doesn't mean it's right. Moral doesn't mean it's right. You guys, I am an independent. I'm a Christian, and I hate those images. I hate to see what's happening. But we have to use our brains. We cannot throw our brains out the window and just say, well, it's moral. We need to go over there and bomb. You cannot do that. We need to be smart as Americans. We need to get people on board. We need to do something, but it's not bombs. Thank you.
Joe, thanks for the call. We'll move on to Tracy, joining us from Minneapolis as we look at the situation in Syria. Good morning, Tracy.
Good morning. In 2003, Wesley Clark gave an interview. It's on YouTube. It's about 2 minutes long. I encourage everyone to look at it. And he had said that the plan was to take over 7 countries in 5 years. And that's pretty important, because that means that they were planning on this whole systematic approach, whether it be Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and all these countries leading up to Syria, then Iran is the final one. I think that that's where we're at, and I think that they know that the American people are not really excited about this, so they have to get creative and tap into our emotional strings. I think that the rebels use the chemical weapons, and then they're going to turn it into a humanitarian. We have to get over there. We have to get in. We have to do this. Otherwise, kids are going to die or something. Then maybe down the road, a nuclear weapon or something, and blame it on Iran so they can complete this plan. I mean, I don't know if it's the elite people in the Israeli, government or us, but I truly believe that this was the plan, and they're going to go full forward head until this gets completed.
Okay. Tracy, thanks for the call. One of our viewers saying Syria has invaded other countries. There are almost 1 million Syrian refugees in neighboring countries. And we are rejoined by Ambassador Edward Djerejian, who's joining us from Rice University. Apologize for the technical snafu. We lost the signal for just a moment. But one of the callers asking about the debt that this country is facing and why the U.S., why we should get involved in this conflict, saying that moral doesn't make right. How do you respond to that sentiment?
Well, this gets to a real core of the principles of American foreign policy. If you go back to Woodrow Wilson and the humanitarian determination of U.S. foreign policy, human rights, self-determination of peoples. And then on the other side, and I'm generalizing, of course, is the realpolitik. What are America's national security interests, both in terms of its domestic strengths, its economy, political, and its national security interests in other parts of the world? And there's always been a tug in American foreign policy formulation between the humanitarian impulse, the Woodrow Wilson school, and the realpolitik school. And we're seeing that in the caller's comment. He's making that argument. And it's one that has been prevalent in American foreign policy formulation for decades. But again, in our political system, we have the Congress, we have the presidency. And the president is really the commander-in-chief, and he is responsible for the conduct of America's foreign policy, with the advice and consent, of course, of the Congress, especially the Senate. And therefore, at the end of the day, it's the buck stops in the Oval Office. So if the president is going to make the case that, again, along the lines of what the caller stated, that this is a moral issue that the United States has to address, that is the humanitarian impulse, the right to protect peoples from weapons of mass destruction or genocide or massacre. This is one argument that can be made for U.S. Military action in Syria. But again, the unintended consequences that you spoke about earlier is something that has to be in the calculus of Washington, because if we do take military action, what about the day after? What can the Syrians do and not do? What will the Iranians do? What will the Russians and the Chinese do in order to make the life of the United States much more difficult because we've taken this action? And so every contingency has to be looked upon on how we can address the unintended consequences of this.
Why has this been such a hard sell for our allies around the world, as we've seen from Secretary of State John Kerry this weekend in Europe and last week as the president tried to convince G20 nations?
Well, I think it's a hard sell. I just came back from a working trip to Europe, and the same, in many ways, the same debate we're having with our Congress here in the United States. They're having these issues in Europe. You saw what happened in Britain, usually our staunchest ally that works very closely with us, especially in foreign policy affairs. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, did not get a parliamentary vote of support. In fact, he was told not to involve Great Britain in military action. François Hollande, the French president, who is very forward-leaning on military action, has to deal with his parliament. And he's got to get a parliamentary vote, and then after parliamentary vote, he's now even talking about the necessity, most likely, to go to the United Nations Security Council. Again, these political leaders are responding to very important public opinion within their countries. Look, the European countries are facing a major economic crisis. That's not over, far from it. And again, they're saying, why should we get involved in the Middle East and spend blood and treasure when we've got much more pressing problems at home? So all the political leaders are facing this constant of public opinion in their countries.
Ambassador Edward Djerejian is joining us from Rice University. He is currently the director of the Baker Institute for Public Policy, named after former Secretary of State James Baker. Kate is joining us, Boulder, Colorado. Good morning.
Yeah, thanks. The previous callers, Mr. Ambassador, brought up a few points I wanted to bring up. One being that we don't know who used the sarin gas. The one fellow did say he was focused on the facts about Syria, but then he repeated an unsubstantiated claim about Iran, referring to, he said something about dealing with their nukes. Well, there's no proof that they have nukes, and so I hope he sticks with some facts. The facts that he wants about Syria. And then the other caller, Tracy, mentioned how there seems, Wesley Clark mentioned about a plan. He might want to go to the Project for a New American Centuries website. But, Mr. Ambassador, I wanted to ask you, who do you think the U.S. Is to be lecturing about killing innocent people, And as the host mentioned, why such a hard sell? I think the hard sell has to do that whether Americans want to look at it or not, we're rolling over a huge pile of dead and horrific deaths in Iraq, including children, so you question about who are we to be lecturing about killing innocent people, and not that the situation in Syria is obviously not horrific. It is. And then Colonel Wilkerson was on MSNBC, Chris Hayes, right after Chris Hayes did a softball interview with Secretary of Defense Kerry, because I would have asked Kerry, you voted for the Iraq War resolution, and now you're lecturing Syria? I mean, he was part and parcel to that horrific situation in Iraq. So Colonel Wilkerson came on, we all know General Powell's aide, and he said, what's the difference? Again, not in any way undermining the horrific situation in Syria, but he said, what is the difference in using napalm on children in Vietnam, white phosphorus on Palestinian children by Israel, or sarin gas? And we don't know who used this. But again, back to who are we to be lecturing about this?
Kate, I'll stop you on that point. Thanks for the call from Colorado. We'll get a response.
Well, I think this latest use of CW, BW in Syria is horrific. It is something that the international community for decades has said is something that has to be banned from use by all countries in the world. And it is something that the international community, I believe, has to stand up to in one way or the other. Whether taking military action at this point is the response is what we're debating in our country now and debating internationally. But you are right that these horrific events have taken place in different parts of the world. In the Syrian case, it's interesting to note that before the use of the CW, approximately 110,000 Syrians have been killed in this conflict. And I've always questioned, when is the Srebrenica moment going to come in Syria? Especially over the last year, when is the humanitarian toll going to attract the attention of the world to help the Syrian people alleviate this crisis that they're facing? And I think the only way out, really, and I've said this before, but it bears repeating, there is no military solution. There's no pure military solution to this. There's only a political solution. And what I would hope for is that our government, in crafting its policies, including whatever decision the president's going to make on the CW issue, that that there's a strategy in Washington for the day after, that how can the United States build on, if it does take military action, build on getting Syria into a political transition to a post-Assad era. In other words, a political solution. And there are ways of doing that. But in order to do that, we're going to have to, and getting back to one of the previous callers, we're going to have to really work in a strategic sense with Russia, that has a lot of cards to play, even Iran, that has a lot of cards to play in Syria, and also can have an influence in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. Where's the strategy? Where is the overarching political strategy that gets us beyond military action? I think this is the critical issue, and frankly, I don't think this debate has taken place in our country. And this frustrates me in a great way, because these are issues of war and peace. They're issues that, in the aftermath of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, we are not having this type of debate. I don't hear this debate in Congress, in the Senate, or in the House. I don't hear it coming out of the executive branch. I hope it's happening. I hope there's some George Kennan in the State Department that's putting together a strategic concept, connecting all the dots of what we may do in Syria and how it affects not only going toward a political solution in Syria, but how it affects what the situation in Iraq is, what Lebanon is, in Israel, in Jordan, in Turkey, and beyond. This debate the American people are not having.
Ambassador Djerejian, thanks very much for being with us, joining us from Rice University in Houston. We appreciate your perspective. Hope to have you on again in the near future. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It was very good being with you.